Good morning. Today is the 24th day of Nisan, the 2nd of May, and we are up to the 5th reading, Parashat Acharei, and almost the entire reading is about a topic that I don't believe we've really talked about in the past, even though it's a very important topic in the Torah. And it's the prohibition against eating blood. So it starts pretty much at the beginning of the reading, Leviticus 17:10. The reading starts a couple of verses earlier, sort of wrapping up what we talked about yesterday. And so let me just read a little bit with the commentary from Vishnevsky. You have been taught, and this was a little bit earlier in chapter 7, verse 26, that you must not consume the blood of animals and fowl. It's animals here includes any kind of kosher animal, whereas there's another piece of the puzzle that we'll see in a moment, which is that the blood of a slaughtered animal or fowl needs to be covered, but not the blood of a slaughtered, I guess the word would be livestock. Livestock their blood does not need to be covered. And it's a very interesting thing in and of itself that we won't discuss today. Maybe we'll get another chance at some other point. But we cover only after the slaughtering only the blood of fowl, meaning chickens, ducks, geese, and animals that are kosher. There are 7 kosher animals. The livestock, which is really just 3 animals, the cows, goats, and sheep, when they're slaughtered, their blood is not covered. In any case, so you've been taught that you must not consume the blood of animals and fowl, the punishment that I will give to anyone of the house of Israel, meaning or of those who are born Jewish, or of the converts who dwell among them, who consumes any blood, whether of sacrificial or non-sacrificial animals, is that I will set my attention upon the individual who consumes the blood, and I will cut him off from among his people, which means that he will die prematurely and childless. This is a punishment that's known as karet. There are different categories of prohibitions for which the punishment is not it's not really given in this world, but rather that the person dies prematurely and doesn't have children. Not having children doesn't mean that they necessarily die without children. It also could mean that after their death, their children don't have offspring. This really brings to mind, and it's hard for me to shake off the analogy to what is going on in the Western world today. It's very, very hard to swallow and to understand. There's actually a category, I don't know what they call it in Hebrew, in English. In Hebrew they call it ahorim, al-horim, people who don't want to be parents, who don't want to have children. And not to mention all the gender confusion and people who don't have children. And this is one of the most boggling sicknesses of the Western world, which is almost impossible to understand. There was never a time in history, at least that I'm aware of, that people said, we choose not to have children. This is like a very, very deep sickness. So it could come also as a you can see it in a certain sense as a punishment. I don't know if to call it even a punishment, but it's almost like a a result of the of Western culture. It's an illness. It's an illness that is an illness of the mind. Obviously, it's not an illness of the body. There's nothing wrong with the body. The body is can certainly reproduce, but there's some kind of illness in the mind, and as it turns out, there's many illnesses that have to do with wealth. These have to do with illnesses like diabetes and heart disease these are illnesses that we see, that people who eat a Western lifestyle, not the diet so much as the quantities, and the type of food also has to do with it, but it's really mostly the quantities. So you get illnesses of the body, but there's also illnesses of the mind, and Western culture doesn't know what to do with these because really we haven't seen them before in the history of humanity. So there's no easy fix for them. On the one hand, you want to give people freedom. You want people to be free, to be responsible for their own destiny, for their own lives. And on the other hand, you see that many people don't know how to handle this properly. And it turns into an illness of the mind, a mental illness. So we'll see in a moment how this all connects to blood. Consuming blood is such a serious offense, he says, because, continuing with verse 11, the continued presence of the soul in the flesh of any creature is dependent upon the presence of the blood in its body. So the soul in the flesh is dependent upon the blood. And this is where the Torah really connects and tells us straight out. The Torah is dualistic, meaning it has a viewpoint. The viewpoint is that there is a spirit and there is flesh. And these are two separate things, and there's something that holds them together, and the part that holds them together is the blood. I have therefore given its blood to you, not to consume, but to be placed upon the altar to atone for your souls. So we understand now that there's a connection between the flesh and the spirit through the blood, but why is it then that the blood is placed upon the altar, and because of that it cannot be eaten? For it is only the blood of a sacrificed animal which houses its animating soul that can atone for the soul. So what he's saying here is, and somehow because the blood is the connection between the flesh and the spirit, when a person has sinned, so he's blemished in some way, this connection between the flesh and the spirit. So by putting the blood of an animal, which also connects the flesh and the spirit of the animal, on the altar, that atones vicariously for the person himself, or he sees himself, as we said, and we talked about the placing of the hands on the animal as the act of connecting the spirits together, and so on. But what I want to focus on is what does the blood really represent in the full gamut of the soul? So I understand that it's a intermediate between the flesh and the spirit, but what does it actually represent? And what is the first point of contact, let's call it, between the flesh and the spirit? So Hasidic teachings tell us that there are two prohibitions that are related one to another, and the one is not consuming blood, not eating blood, but there's another type of part of the animal that we don't consume, even in a kosher animal, which is certain types of fat. Not all the fat, but certain parts of the fat. And the parts of the fat that are not consumed are not called by the usual name in Hebrew, which would be shuman, that means fat, but rather the Torah calls it by a different name, and the sages make this distinction. It's called chelev. And chelev is also fat. It's another word for fat, but it specifically denotes the types of fat that are forbidden from being eaten because they are placed on the altar. So this is a very interesting thing, that things that are placed on the altar sometimes are forbidden from being eaten. So I want us to understand these two things together. And Hasidic teachings tell us that the fat designates the faculty of pleasure in the soul, as we probably would associate anyway. It's very logical to associate fat with pleasure. That's the added value, let's call it, beyond the flesh. And the blood that animates the person as the will. And if you remember, we've talked about this in the past, the crown, the supernal crown, the superconsciousness, is made out of three different heads, we call them, three different beginnings, and they're called faith, pleasure, and will. Emunah, ta'anug, ratzon. So these two, the fat that is forbidden and the blood, are the pleasure and the will. And what it's saying is basically like this: not all types of pleasure are forbidden. There are some types of pleasure that are certainly allowed. So that's why in pleasure, it's not that all fat is forbidden. There's only small, minuscule amounts of fat around the kidneys and around the diaphragm. Those fats are not allowed to be consumed, but everything else can be consumed. So this is like telling us that most of the pleasures in the world are acceptable. There is only a small amount that cannot be pursued. But when it comes to will, all blood is forbidden. So what is that telling us about will? Obviously, what it means is that will is sacred. Why is will so sacred? Why is it so important that will not be something to be consumed? It's all placed on the altar in a certain sense. Whatever blood is used in some way, it's only in order to pour from it on the altar or sprinkle on it from the blood on the altar or on the curtain in the Holy of Holies. This is probably the point of contest between Judaism and every other system in the world, which is, does God have a will? And this is the point, one might say. When we came out of Egypt and we were given the Torah, the whole point was to come and say that the world is not just God's act, it's also governed by His will. It's not the same thing at all. And what would be the difference? The difference would be that if I say that the world is just God, it's just nature, and nature is God, so then I'm saying that God doesn't want anything in particular from the world, so you can do basically whatever you want, as people say, as long as you don't hurt someone else. Let's say that's your tenet. That came from Kant. Kant's idea was that don't do something to other people because they'll do it back to you. So act towards other people the way you would want to be treated yourself. It's called Kant's moral imperative. It's a very famous thing. And in other words, a person should expect others to behave towards him the way that he behaves towards other people. So if that's your moral dictum, so then it becomes that you can do whatever you want. Because why? Because God is still the world. You're not divorcing the world from God. You're just saying, you're not saying the world was necessarily not created. But what you are saying is that God doesn't want anything from the world. The world is not a reflection of what He wants. It's just a reflection of His creation, the way He created it. It's a system that He put in place. And you just have to obey the system. Don't jump off of buildings because you'll die because of gravitation. Learn how to eat properly. Learn how to sleep properly. Do everything properly. You'll have a good life. But there's no thought that God wants something from the world. Is there something that needs to happen? Is there something that we need to achieve? Now this is amazing because even if you go to Christianity, you don't really find this concept that God wants something from you. There's no list of demands. There's no list of commandments. There's no list of things that you need to do. And certainly there's no understanding that somehow when we all reach a certain moral level or a certain level of conduct, that a higher level of divinity will be revealed. It's not dependent on that. When God decides, let's say, so okay, He'll redeem the world, He'll change the world because He has that ability. But it's not connected that He revealed to us something that He wants, and now we are obligated to perform that. But this whole idea, and that's why we would say in the end that there's no other nation that reveres blood in this way, in the sense that it won't eat it. Again, if blood represents will, then it's coming and saying that will is sacred. There's something about will that is the central aspect of being a human being, of connecting the flesh with the spirit. The will that I have, that's my most important thing that I have. And therefore I want to make my will similar to God's will. I want the same things. I want to sanctify my flesh, my spirit. I do that by sanctifying my blood, as it were. And the way that I do this is by teaching my animal soul, and it's exactly what it is. The blood is the animal soul. How to act properly, what to do and what not to do. These things, they govern the interface between the flesh and the spirit. They govern our basic humanity. But you can only have this prohibition from eating blood and treating blood as something sacred, that in a sense is actually the opposite. We place it on the altar because of its sanctity, because not because it's not because it's something that we're pushing away. On the contrary, we're putting it on the altar. The idea there, and we're sprinkling it on the curtain that divides between the Holy of Holies and the Holy, the two parts of the inner sanctuary. And again, the idea here is that without the Torah revealing God's will, there's no room for this prohibition. There's no room for looking at blood in this way as something sacred, because how important it is in Jewish life that my life is governed by what is allowed and what is not allowed, and I'm trying to bring myself and the rest of the world to a certain level of performance of God's commandments, whether it's being a Jew and having as many commandments as a Jew has, or being a non-Jew and having the commandments that a non-Jew has. But in either case, the frame of mind is that God has will. He wants something from the world. He wants something from me. He wants something from you. He has will. And the world is not just a natural occurrence. It's not just a reflection of what is possible, of a possible world. It's a reflection of a potential world. A world that when it follows the will of God, it reaches a certain level. And that's the idea that's hiding behind, in short, that's hiding behind this prohibition of not eating blood. Now, going back to what we discussed before, when you live in a world, in a society that is so free, the main thing that you lose is this frame of mind that God wants something from you, because you're so free to do whatever you want. You can't even put that into your mind frame that somehow God wants something from me. I have a purpose here. And when you lose that, that's exactly when you lose the will to have children. When you basically lose the sanity of the mind to act normally as it did for centuries, when there was clearly people lived in a situation where they were obligated, where there was something wanted from them, not just wanted but also demanded, and that they were obligated towards. And that is the danger of Western culture that we have today, which is that we value the freedom. We think it's tremendously important for people to develop. On the other hand, it can go to the other side where there is no concept of will, and therefore you get exactly this thing of you can eat the blood, meaning you consume the will. There's no will. God doesn't want anything from the world. You can be whatever you want. There's no limits on your will. And the end result is that you're cut off from the people. In other words, you die prematurely and childless. So God, this is a topic that we'll get another chance to revisit next week, because the prohibitions for eating blood continue next week again. We'll have another chance to talk about it, maybe in a little bit more depth, about this concept of will. So thanks for joining today. Hope to see you tomorrow.